Hello and welcome to another episode of Borderlands Stories from Ukraine. I'm here with Dave and Glenn. We hope will be joining us, but he's busy with important people right now, as he says. And Glenn is a well-known security expert in this region, so we'll respect that, and hopefully he comes on. But Dave, just wanted to do a couple things. First of all, welcome everyone to the this regular update that we've been doing on the situation in Ukraine. I just wanted to take a few moments to update everyone who's watched this what the Borderlands Foundation is and what we're doing. I've spent the last few weeks in Washington, D.C., and one of the things that we're working on right now is turning the Borderlands Foundation into a historical Ukrainian war historical foundation or think tank that will help us to study in depth the impacts of the war on society in Ukraine, but also the lessons for that in the future for the U.S. Army or U.S., Ukraine, and really all the Western militaries that I think should really learn the lessons from this. So this is one of the things that Foundation does, or we're working on doing, is setting up a historical center. I'm going to go move back to Ukraine in the next, hopefully, month, get there in early June and see if we can get set up there. I'm working on a documentary about the war as an executive producer on a project, and also want to start writing some early drafts of the history of the war for lessons learned. So that's one of the things we're doing. The other thing we do at the Borderlands Foundation is we've created an app that's actually working. If you go to our site, where you can donate to real Ukrainians in need impacted by the war, that's where we want our charitable giving for people who appreciate the content that you get from the foundation in terms of these broadcasts and articles that we'll write in the future. And just wanted to update everyone on that and what we're doing. So Dave, things are, I wouldn't say slowing down by any stretch for the soldiers that are on the front line. This is absolutely intense fighting, but from the Western media perspective, I would say the interest or the amount of footage or the amount of news coverage, Twitter streams are certainly declining, which I think is natural. Unfortunately, in the West, is we have a short attention span. But what I wanted to do today was really take a step back with you, Dave, and examine where we are in the war and what's coming up this summer, because I'm actually going to have to take at least a few weeks break from producing content. I'm getting married next week to Katya, my fiance from Ukraine, and then after that we'll be doing a little bit of traveling and getting set up back in Ukraine. But I wanted to really use this time to reflect back on what's happened, but more importantly, where we are right now and what could happen in the summer. And again, as Michael Kaufman, the top Russia expert in the United States, probably the world, actually, Russian military expert outside of Russia at least, and I don't know how well.
There's no experts in Russia. It's okay.
Yeah, there's certainly no experts in Russia, but he likes to say, I just met him in D.C. and spent some time with him. He says everything in war is contingent. So it's really everything's unpredictable. That's the beauty of history, is how crazy it is in terms of when you look back at what's happened. So as a historian, we much prefer to look at what happened and tell neat stories about it rather than predict. But I do think for those who follow this broadcast or this podcast, that it's important for us to look at where we are. So let's go through the agenda for today. And I really wanted to talk about first and foremost, Dave, a counteroffensive that started to pick up steam. Actually, really has about a week ago, right when we'll get to Victory Day in a moment, Russian Victory Day, but right as Vladimir Putin was supposedly celebrating Victory Day in Russia, Ukraine launched a massive counteroffensive, and that has started and gone quite well. In fact, Ukraine has basically broken the siege of Kharkiv, which was never a full siege. Kharkiv was never surrounded, but it certainly was bombarded by artillery and rockets every day. And the Ukrainian armed forces have launched what seems to be a very coordinated counteroffensive around Kharkiv, but also pushing towards Izium, which is south of Kharkiv and threatens the Donbass region. And Dave, just wanted to get your thoughts and reflections on what's going on up there, and how important this second, aside from outside of Kiev and northern Ukraine, now a second coordinated counteroffensive, which a lot of people would argue that the counteroffensive around Kiev and Sumy and those regions was actually a very well organized Russian retreat, which obviously the Ukrainians pressured them out on all fronts. But what's your read on the current counteroffensive in Kharkiv, Dave, and what's happened?
Yeah, I'll start out with saying that no one needs to confuse the pace of the strategic and operational level of war with the violence that still happens at the tactical level, right? And that's what you started off with, right? It is moving slow strategically and operationally, but tactically there are still violent engagements and battles being fought. But the campaigns, the operations are moving rather slow. For the most part, Kharkiv being an exception right now. There will probably be another exception in about a week, because that seems to be the flow. So, yeah, Kiev's really a withdrawal under pressure is what we'd call that, doctrinally, where Russia they were withdrawing and being pushed out as well. Kharkiv, I think, was a little bit different. I think you had Russia didn't necessarily want to withdraw there, but they were pushed out. And what I think happened is you had a confluence of events happen. Ukraine was able to reallocate combat power. There is support from the West that came in, and it looks like that's where a lot of that was initially allocated. That really helped shape the fight. And it looks like upwards of 19 BTGs pushed out of Ukraine and back into Russia. So some estimates I've seen, there are only 3 Russian BTGs still in Ukraine in that area holding on. And that's probably just securing a couple lines of communication for Russia to get all their stuff out. So some questions I would have about that is, what do those Russian BTGs look like? We know logistically they were already challenged. So what are the effects of some of the new equipment that got in and was put into use a lot faster than I thought it would, by a couple weeks. So it's, what difference did that make, in the battlefield, geometry, and battlefield effects that help shape that up there. And then what's Russia going to do with those units? That's the big question I have. Can they reconstitute them? Probably not. Can they reorganize and piecemeal them back together? Probably. and reconstitute them further in the east, southeast, more near Donetsk. I think what also is happening here, this is starting to roll the Russian line. Because right now it looks like Izium's probably going to be the next push from Ukraine, and that's going to roll, and Russia's going to roll out of there as well. So ultimately, does this cause Russia to readdress their aim and limit their scope even more? So that's a couple things I've been looking at around the Kharkiv area with the very successful counterattack that happened over the past 4 or 5 days.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, Dave, that's been brought up by American intelligence and a lot of analysts is allegedly there's 93 BTGs in Ukraine, but no one knows really what a BTG means anymore in terms of real combat power, whether that's
Correct.
a company or two companies, but certainly they're not full strength battalion tactical groups, and it's very hard to use those as a measure of combat power. And I think the 19 BTGs you're talking about were actually BTGs that were in Belgorod already that are reconstituting. And around Kharkiv, there might have been 4 or 5 that were pushed out, with a lot of obviously artillery supporting them that were pushed out. But what's interesting is those 19 BTGs, battalion tactical groups that are in Belgorod, have not come down to the rescue, have not counterattacked, have not really done anything. So the question is, what's the state of those 19 battalion tactical groups that are probably being reconstituted? And what Kharkiv being relieved does is, the major significance is it basically takes, just like when they retreated from Kyiv, it takes the Russian artillery and even rocket artillery out of the range of being able to shell the city, which relieves a tremendous amount of pressure on Kharkiv, both the residential areas, but any defense industry that's going on there, which there are certainly. There's a lot of industry in Kharkiv too. And then it also allows Ukraine to start putting pressure, because they've basically gone all the way up to the Svirty Donetsk River, which is allows them to now start pressuring the supply lines with artillery, ground lines of communication that are supplying Russian forces in Izium. And last week, allegedly, General Gerasimov was in Izium. There was a command post that was destroyed by Ukrainian rocket fire, which they speculated General Gerasimov was there. They said he was potentially wounded, lightly wounded in that attack. Now, there's no confirmation that he was wounded, but interestingly enough, after that rocket attack, there have been no further advances from Izium. There's even been a shifting of Russian combat power, it seems, to the east around Popasna and Severodonetsk, these fortress towns that are farther to the east. And it seems like you're right, Izium could be the next area that is attacked in a large coordinated manner. And there already have been Ukrainian counterattacks around Izium, but it looks like the pressure on that will continue to build. And then moving to the east, we had one major town fall, or let's say a very organized retreat from that town of Popasna, where Wagner and Chechen Wagner mercenaries, which is Russian private army, and some Chechen forces, which who knows if they're fighting, but they're certainly taking TikTok videos. We're
lots of them.
Yeah, we're in the town of Popasna, and Ukrainians set up an alternate fallback defensive position that's apparently fortified from there. And it seems, and this is one of the big questions of today, is at what point is the Russian offensive going to culminate here? Meaning they've basically not been able to hold Kharkiv, are under pressure around Izium, that entire axis. And there's some very small gains near Lyman and Popasna, and pressure still being applied around Severodonetsk. But it seems like the momentum is going out of the Russian offensive. And actually, one story that came out this week was about a Russian bridging operation where apparently 73 armored vehicles and tanks, basically an entire battalion plus maybe 2 battalions worth of equipment.
Yeah, it's close to 2.
Yeah, was destroyed by Ukrainian artillery, and there could have been hundreds. There's even speculation of up to 1,500 casualties in that one large battle, which was near the line. Bilohorivka, I think it's near Severodonetsk area. So even in the area where the Russians are really pushing, they're having some major setbacks, and now these M777s, the American towed artillery, are finally getting into theater. There's first footage of them being used, and Russian artillery is now being outranged and I'm sure outgunned by the Ukrainian artillery, which is a huge turn of events, because Russians to this point have really only been able to win on the artillery front. They just have a lot more artillery pieces organically in their army, and they shoot a lot, and that makes up for their lack of infantry. So, Dave, what are your thoughts on what's going on in the main battle zone now in Donbass?
Yeah, and and when you talk artillery with Russia, that's something we've always known, and we've always really accepted that. Russia has lots of artillery, not necessarily good, but volume makes up for quality. That's just what we've always expected. I find it interesting that I shouldn't at this point, that Russia continues to do very simple tactical tasks poorly, and they continue to fail to have any kind of local security. That bridge crossing, and there's video of it, from Ukrainian unmanned aerial systems. There's no near side security. There's no far side security on that river crossing. Nothing. Just put in the bridge and think you're going to drive across it in Ukrainian territory. It's still mind-boggling to me that lesson is, after almost 3 months of this conflict, Russia hasn't figured out that they need to have security at any level. They don't have it at any level. And it just opens themselves up. And that was a direct fire attack. That wasn't even, unmanned aerial system shooting, missiles. That was a surface attack, direct fire.
Well, I think it was a lot of artillery, some Air Force, and of course some Ukrainian. Yeah. There was Ukrainian forces basically brought in. First of all, apparently an engineer who posted about this on Twitter said they guessed correctly where the bridge crossing would be, so they pre-sighted in artillery. It was a foggy day. The Russians were doing a lot of things right, like trying to obscure with smoke and other things, but the Ukrainian engineers had guessed the right location and brought in a huge amount of artillery. And I think what you're seeing here, and what's really important, is the Russian Air Force is obviously more numerous than Ukraine's, but they still not achieved air superiority to the point where they can really support ground operations well. On the other hand, I would say that the Ukrainians have achieved much more drone superiority at the lower tactical and operational drone level. And what those drones allow them to do is sight in artillery, call it in, adjust it. And now that their artillery pieces outrange the Russians by a good 9 kilometers, they can really take the fight to the Russians and beat them at their own game, which is artillery. And this isn't mass artillery, but it's well sighted.
It's
precision artillery with great surveillance and reconnaissance with drones, which, Dave, back in the old days, we didn't have that when we were lieutenants. We counted on ourselves and vehicles and individuals to spot artillery.
But now, you would never shoot on observed. That we would, 15, 20 years ago, we would consider that an unobserved fire.
Yeah.
Even though you can see it through a drone.
Exactly.
And it's giving you a 10-digit grid.
Yeah.
In 4K high definition. That would still be an unobserved fire 20 years ago.
And that's what's really changed here is I was talking with Michael Kaufman from the Center for Naval Analysis, and there's been all this noise about javelins and the new T-90 Russian tanks that are coming onto the battlefield, and all of these different and they're getting destroyed, and all these other things, but ultimately this is a old-fashioned artillery war, which that's why they call artillery king of battle. It really can and usually does in conventional fights cause the most casualties, and your success in managing your artillery, which is getting it onto the battlefield, getting it supplied with enough rounds, which is the main challenge for Ukraine. Being, let's say, everyone has a limited amount, no one has unlimited amounts of artillery ammo, although the Russians seem to have a lot more, but you shouldn't waste it. And the Ukrainians seem to be making much better use of the artillery they do have with drones and other ways that they're able to call in artillery, mainly with drones, I think, to really keep the Russians on their back foot. And that's where it looks like the battle of the Donbass, as it's being called right now, is going to be determined by the effectiveness and the supplies of artillery. And the drones and the artillery, those two together, I think are going to be decisive in this fight.
Yeah, and I think the big difference here is when you talk the ineffectiveness of the Russian Air Force, I think it's because it's not integrated with ground movement and maneuver. They're not mutually supporting. Russia's artillery is not. They're working separate. Even the artillery and their armor and the infantry, the close air support, they're all working separate. They all have. It's all separate stovepipes. Nothing's junctioning together. On the Ukrainian side, you're seeing very effective indirect fires because you're seeing the IPB. The Ukrainian engineer says, hey, we guessed right. Well, you guessed right because he probably did a terrain analysis. He's an engineer boat guy, right? He knows that river. There's only so many places where you can actually cross and put a float bridge in where you have a near and a far side anchor that's good enough to get armored vehicles on that float bridge and across, right? So there's intelligence preparation to the battlefield happening on the Ukrainian side, which enables them to, build some targets and target groups for artillery, right? And they're 777s, so they're digital. So they probably also have the fire control systems, right? So they've got the targets already input into these. and they have multiple targets, right, based on their IPB. So it's not that hard to shift those guns onto those targets and start firing, because they have ballistic data, they have firing data to shoot those targets. So even if they're not exactly on there, they can get to them pretty quickly with the 777. Vice an older system that's more manual, right? The 777, you still have to move it to a degree, right? But the computer does a lot of the targeting for you, as long as you're within a certain deviation off the target line. So I think that's the integration is really what's making a difference on Ukraine's side right now, and the